LightCasting. Hi, sweet souls. Welcome to I'm Awake, Now What? A podcast investigating the intersectionality of spirituality, healing, and personal development. I'm your host, Krista Xiomara. Rack up some good karma by leaving a 5-star rating, and write a review if you're enjoying the show, and tell your friends about it. This week I sit down with author, coach, and human potential expert, Dr. Robyn McKay, to discuss her work supporting high-achieving women, cultivating spiritual intelligence, and the mental health effects of a spiritual awakening. Dr. Robyn shares a pivotal life moment that changed her path forever and how a divine calling turned into her life's work. Dr. Robyn also offers guidance for healing your nervous system so your consciousness can have a clear runway in which to land and fly. Dr. Robyn McKay, welcome to the podcast.
So happy to be here with you. I can't wait to dive in.
Me too. I'm so excited. There's so many things that we have in common to talk about, so I'm excited to have this conversation with you today. I want to give you the opportunity to introduce yourself to the listening audience in your words about who you are and what you're doing today.
Well, I'm a STEM girl at heart, and I know we talked about this before we started recording. I got my first microscope when I was 10. I was profoundly disappointed in the light source. It was a mirror. And it wasn't until I was in my 20s with my biology major that I started in the biotech space that I actually got to use high-powered microscopes, and I was very excited about that. But that was also a time in my life where I started to burn out. I had been traveling 45 minutes each way to get to work. My idea at the time of self-care was stopping at the Krispy Kreme store and getting 2 Krispy Kreme donuts.
It's so good.
It was so delicious at the time, and a Diet Coke, and that was my self-care for the day. And I always knew, in addition to being a STEM girl, I always had a deep and abiding connection with God and Source. From the time I was a little girl, my mom taught me how to pray when I was under 3 years old. I remember the moment that I came online with that prayer. I was raised Catholic. So it was an angel of God prayer, just calling in my guardian angel. And from that moment on, I knew that I was never alone. And I knew that there was so much more than what our human eyes and human hearts could maybe comprehend. So I've always been both science and spirit, reason and intuition, logic and emotion. And you can also imagine perhaps the complexities that would develop over my life, because everyone was kind of either one or the other. And I think that I didn't know what to do with myself, and I didn't understand myself. All I knew is that in my generation, when I was a smart girl, I was pretty good in science, and I was either supposed to be a doctor or an engineer. And I found my way into biotech, but I always knew from the time I was a little kid that I wanted to be a doctor to help and heal people, and I also wanted to write books. So my spiritual awakening came about 4 or 5 years into my work in biotech, when I found a picture of myself from high school graduation with bright eyes and looked like I had the world by the tail. And at that time, 10 years later, I certainly didn't feel like I did. I was heavier than I had ever been. I was depressed and anxious, burned out, didn't know it. All I knew is that girl who was there in that picture was not me, and it certainly wasn't the life that she had intended or envisioned when she was 18 and fearless.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I want to unpack a little bit more about your religious upbringing, which is always my second question. And also just to affirm to you, I've always been like that as well, too. I love science and facts and data. And we'll unpack this a little bit more when we talk about the spiritual awakening and trying to reconcile both the mystical and, the factual of the reality that's in front of us is something really hard to do. And you're right that you find people leaning one way or another and sort of forgetting facts or like real hard information and evidence. And then, the vice versa of that. And that, I think, it's a spectrum, and we'll unpack that a little bit more. But for you, where did you end up taking your religious and spiritual experience through your life journey? So you started out as a Catholic, and where are you now? Are you still leaning into that? Where did you land?
Oh, well, that's an evolutionary process, isn't it?
Yes.
So when I was a little girl, I really loved the ceremony. I loved going to mass. I loved my mom would be on the cleaning committee or whatever, and we would go clean the church during Saturday mornings or whatever. And I always loved that space. I loved the sanctuary of it, actually. And so for most of my early upbringing, I was very much invested in Catholic beliefs and Catholic church and going to church, and that was just part of our everyday lives. What the Catholic Church didn't really unpack for me was this intuition that I've always had. I would know things like in third grade when my math teacher was going to have a pop quiz. So I'd just stay in and study for the pop quiz at recess, and then I would get an A on it. And I never told anybody those things, because who do you tell that to? But I just always had this kind of innate knowing when somebody was feeling poorly, or knowing when something was going on with people that they maybe weren't saying out loud. So there was just always this native intuition that I had that didn't really get tapped into or described or understood by anybody in the Catholic Church, for sure. But my relationship with my guides, with my angels, with the realms beyond what we can see with our physical eyes, that was something that was very much part of my experience with Mother Mary, especially. As a child, my mom would take us to crown Mary on May Day. Right? That was just something that we did. And for me, it was beyond just like a statue and flowers. It was like legit ceremony. Like I remember totally getting into this as a little kid and just feeling like it was, of course, we're going to do this. So that the traditional Catholic wasn't bad for me. And my family moved pretty quickly into more of a charismatic movement, because we had this ability to heal. And it just kind of aligned with what was going on in the charismatic Catholic, laying on hands and things like that. But that comes from my dad's family, this innate ability to heal, the intuition, the being able to put hands on people and create transformation, or even just being able to speak words and create transformation. That came from my dad's family, and that took me longer to integrate or to understand, because there was no really language or framework for that. So the turning point came for me when I was 18, I'm in mass, Saturday evening mass, because, then you didn't have to get up and go on Sundays. And I was really conflicted about where to go to college. And all of a sudden it was after communion. I'd gone, and you kneel after communion and you're supposed to be in contemplation and prayer. And I was kind of doing that, but I was also thinking about like what I was going to do after with my friends who were also at mass. And all of a sudden this voice came in to my head and said, you need to be a nun. And I was just like, it was like this booming voice. My mom and my sister were with me, and they had no idea that I was having this existential crisis of like, I just got this directive that I'm supposed to be something. And I didn't want to. I wanted to go to college. I wanted to date boys. I wanted to go to parties and have kind of just a normal life. Mm-hmm. And I remember sitting back from that and arguing and saying, no, I don't want to do this. I do not want this. Mm-hmm. And that was a time when I really leaned out away from all of the guidance that I had received up until that point. And I really went out on my own for about 10 years. By the way, during that 10-year period, that was a time when I got very anxious, depressed. I got Epstein-Barr virus. My parents got divorced. Like there were all of these like very human things that were going on. And it's not lost on me that when I disconnected from my guidance, that's kind of when all of these other very human experiences came in. And maybe they would have anyway. I probably would have handled them better had I not been angry at the directive that had come through for me.
Okay, but so you're obviously not a nun. I mean, you can't just
I'm
drop
not.
that.
I know.
You can't
Hashtag
drop that.
Abby.
You can't drop that bomb and then
walk away from it.
Yeah, and just walk away from it. But okay, so you didn't listen to that calling. What has that meant to not listen to that specific calling and intuition? How did you reconcile coming back to that? I need to know. Inquiring minds need to
I
know.
know. So think about that. I'm 18 and and if I tell somebody, if I tell my mom I just got this directive, guess where I land?
Yeah, in a convent
Right?
tomorrow.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, it turns out I actually went to a Catholic women's college for 2 years that were run by nuns. It was run by nuns and they had a convent on the campus. So it wasn't too far from that. It took me a long time to resolve because I had a tremendous amount of guilt about ignoring that calling. And you know what? To this day, I'm not entirely convinced of what that voice actually was, because my actual lived experience as an adult with a mature responsibility for my spirituality knows that my guidance has always been very subtle. Spirit is always very polite. And perhaps my misgivings were more the source of the voice versus what the directive actually was, first of all, if that makes sense.
No, I get that 1,000%.
So there is this level of discernment. However, the amount of guilt I felt about not following that was something that I know contributed to the mental health stuff that I had going on in my late teens and into my 20s. So where I finally resolved that little piece, I had a conversation with my creative writing teacher from high school, Jeannie Helmer. She was somebody who I could talk to. She had really genuine, unconditional, positive regard for me. Like she didn't get judgy. She just listened. Like she was the one who really opened up, activated my creativity and my writing and me becoming a writer. So I remember talking with her, and I was in my mid-20s at that point. I told her this story and she said, Robyn, think about the time in your life. You know you're meant to be a spiritual leader. The only archetype that you had available to you at 18 as a Catholic girl was a nun in the church. That was the only example.
The highest form,
Exactly.
of spirituality.
And the highest form of leadership,
Yeah.
spirituality in the church that a
Or the
woman
feminine, yeah.
was able to engage in. There are other expressions of spiritual leadership besides becoming a nun. So while maybe the spirit of the message was true, which it is, we know that because that's who I am, the package that it was contained in created this pressure in me to say yes or no to something that I knew I didn't want to do that. I knew I didn't want to be that version of spiritual leader. So that was in my mid-20s, but honestly, it took me probably until my mid-30s or something to really let that land. And by that time, I was studying psychology. I had gotten into my PhD program. And I remember talking with my professor, Tom, he was my advisor in my program, who was a Buddhist. And I was sharing this story with him. And he said, very kind of conspiratorially with me, he says, psychologists are considered lay priests because people come to us and we are like vaults around stories. Like there's that confidentiality piece, of course, and that's what priests are too in confession, literally vaults, right? So I had that aha moment of like, oh, well, this is an expression of, at the time, the expression of the spiritual leader that made the most sense for me in psychology. And then since then, I've been able to expand that even more into being able to just stand in my own as a spiritual leader, recognizing that this has always been part of my soul path, my soul blueprint to be in spiritual leadership, and to do so in a way that is, there's no box for it. It's like, what do I want to say?
There's no real container for it because it's so expansive and evolutionary in and of itself, right?
Yes. And it is really a bridge to what's next. And I think that sometimes I'm from the future. And so sometimes the best thing that we can do is kind of put a box around what we're doing, even with spiritual leader. What even is that?
Yeah.
Because there's a lot of baggage around spirituality, spiritual leadership, and things like that. So it just is. That's where I've landed now. Is just I'm in this place of being a leader who happens to be tuned in, tapped in, energetically clear channel and have the psychological and spiritual maturity to be able to discern what's true from what's not true.
Thank you for unpacking all of that. I think in that vein, we'll also try to unpack what happens to somebody and when they're in a spiritual awakening, and then sort of the mental effects of that as well. I know for my experience, I grew up in an occultic offshoot of Catholicism myself that was very toxic, but I was told and indoctrinated for so long with the idea that the community will always be there for you, like Jesus loves everybody. But like the moment you step out of that community, like Jesus ain't there. And having that like reconciliation and all of that internally to try to figure out for yourself, how are you going to listen to this thing, this calling, this push, this nudge? For you, what was that like stepping into something else? And since you are from the future and things probably didn't align, what was that like, and how was your mental health sort of impacted?
Oh, wow. This is such an interesting point in the conversation, isn't it? Because when we get to a point where, for me, the awakening happened way back when I was like 2 and my mom taught me how to pray. So I was always awake. The time that I took adult responsibility for my spiritual gifts was in my late 20s, right around the time I had that, I call it my quarter life crisis, right? When I was like looking at the high school picture of me going, where are you? Is this all there is? I had a pretty good life. I was married to my college sweetheart, working in the biotech industry. We bought our first house when I was in my mid-20s, like that whole thing, kind of living the American dream, if you will, checking all the boxes. And I'm like, that day that I looked at that picture, I really looked around and I thought, I think I'm living somebody else's life. I really do.
Wow.
I hadn't gotten my PhD or my doctorate yet. I hadn't been living into the vision that I had known from the time I was a little girl to be a doctor and to write books. So during that time, I decided that I was going to leave my marriage. And that was more the focus in my family and in the wider community than whatever Robyn's doing spiritually or energetically. Everyone was just like, how dare you? I had a family member call me and say, get your ass back to your marriage. And so that was the thing that they focused on, was Robyn's leaving the marriage versus Robyn has lost so much of her soul. She's depressed. She's anxious. She's trying to find a way through this. And fortunately, Krista, my soul, I know, has always been guiding me, because as soon as I made the decision to leave the marriage, I got into therapy, but not just with anybody. I got into therapy with somebody who had done a whole lot of work around soul retrieval, around shamanism, around other ways of knowing and being, past lives, like all of these things that I had been curious about from the time I was a little girl. By the way, when I was in middle school, I used to sneak into the library, the public library, and go back to the witchcraft section and read books on, like, I would like hide back there and read books on witchcraft. And I was so curious about other ways of knowing other than what I was learning in Catholic school, right? So, and I didn't want anybody to find out, because I knew that there would be consequences if somebody found out that I was actually learning these other ways of knowing. So when I met my therapist, Dr. Mundy, and started opening to him around my energetic and spiritual experiences, he referred me to a shaman. I did some shamanic work. I actually learned how to do soul retrievals on my own. My guides taught me a methodology of soul retrieval, or of current life regression and calling your consciousness back into the present moment. They taught me how to do that. And then I go to
What the soul retrieval is basically uploading all of your knowing, essentially.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. And the consciousness back into your current form. And so I started doing that very early on. And I went to my therapist, Dr. Mundy, and I'm like, I have this thing. And he said, if you can do that for yourself, you can do it for other people.
Wow.
And so that guidance came in. And then slowly I started moving into what would amount to be about a 7-year apprenticeship in spiritual intelligence. While, by the way, I was doing my day job in the pharmaceutical industry, while, by the way, I was also getting my PhD. So, it just makes good sense to do everything. And I was building a house and I was doing all of these things. But it just made sense for me to go through this whole process together. It was really an uncovering of my talents, my abilities, a reclaiming of what my path was that had always been present for me, but in my 20s, especially when I had the mental health stuff going on, the depression, the anxiety, I was having panic attacks, all of those symptoms for me were that I was not living in alignment with the truth of who I was, with what my mission was. And there was my soul calling of just like, you have to do a course correction. So when
Having
it comes,
that like constant pull going back and forth, tugging, and then you
the
finally have to
toggling,
listen. Yeah, you just
I
have to
just want
listen.
to be, I would say, I just want to be like everybody else. And then I would be over here like reading tarot cards. Like, do you really want to be like everybody else? Because I don't think so. So when it comes to spiritual awakening, one of the things in my personal experience, but listen, I've done thousands of readings and thousands of coaching sessions with people who are on the awakening path, who are creative, who are intuitive, who are trying to live kind of in between spaces. And one of the biggest questions that they ask me when they awaken and around this period is, am I going crazy? So there is that question mark that, with my family, it was, is Robyn going crazy because she wants to get divorced? And then it became, oh, it's not just that. Now she's doing all of these other things over here. She's completely changing her life. Maybe she's going crazy because it's not, air quotes, normal. And maybe you had an experience like that as well, of the fear of being rejected by community is one of the greatest ways that keeps us connected and keeps our souls dampened by suppressing our natural inclination to grow because we want to stay in a place where we belong and are accepted. So there can be crazy making that happens. And I always want to say that, from a psychological perspective, we always have to look at outcomes. We always have to look at, like, what are the results of the decisions that you're making? Are you destroying things? Are you destroying relationships? Are you thriving? Like, what are the outcomes?
Are you destroying yourself by
you
staying or by acquiescing to the community pressure? There's so many ways you can take that question.
Yeah. So we have to look at that, and we have to understand that, especially now, there are so many more people who are waking up, but there are equal parts, I think, who are still, on the traditional kind of normal life, who look at us and go, what is even happening over there? And the first thing that they're going to do is put a label of crazy. Now, there are mental health concerns that we have to pay attention to, and there are also spiritual gifts that maybe the mental health stuff is masking, distorting. We don't know until we really look at it.
Yeah, it's funny because I had a very similar trajectory, so it's funny that we're having this conversation. But if I could have done things differently, what I would have done is, like, I went and told my family, I'm getting divorced and I'm leaving the Catholic Church. And those two things combined literally sent their heads spinning. They haven't forgiven me. My parents are constantly in concern about my soul and just that constant pressure around that. But if I had, in hindsight, I probably would have done what you did and maybe left the religious and spiritual awakening out and just focused on, I'm getting out of this marriage because I'm causing myself damage and potentially this other person by not living into the truth of what is being revealed to me in this situation. It's not good. It's not going to be good for either of us long term. One of us is going to die, internally or not. And so I love that you had a very similar experience, because I had that as well.
That's amazing. And I always look at everything works together for our good.
Yeah. 1,000%.
So had you made that decision to only focus on the marriage, then at some point you would have had to rip the Band-Aid off.
Yeah.
So you seem to me like the person who's just going to rip the Band-Aid off.
I am, and I think one of my core qualities and characteristics, I'm honest to a fault and also naive in how I understand, even though I have a lot of wisdom in myself about how people will receive that honesty. Sometimes I don't think about it. And I'm glad I didn't think about it back then. And I don't know how you feel about that. But when we're thinking about the spiritual awakening and the mental health aspect of it, I think it's important also to maybe provide some additional things that people might be able to do if they're going through this similar transition. So for you, like, what kind of support aside from going to therapy did you sort of insulate yourself with so you could get through this really weird and hard time of your life?
So here's the thing that I've come to understand through both my personal experience, but also my professional work that I have done for years now, which is that consciousness gets filtered through our nervous system.
Mm-hmm.
When our nervous systems are anxious, depressed, angry, impulsive, burned out, sensitive to stress,
Yeah.
when our nervous systems are red hot, and then we have this consciousness that flows through it, which is creative, intuitive, sweet, powerful. The filter through which the consciousness is sent distorts the consciousness, if you will. So I am a highly imaginative, visionary person. I see all kinds of things that are outside of like 3D.
Yeah.
When my nervous system is running red hot, like it was when I was in my 20s, I would see worst case scenarios, car crashes, fires. It was all very fear driven. So one of the things that I had to really do first is get my nervous system managed. I had to heal my nervous system. I didn't have words for that back then. What I knew was that I couldn't keep feeling as anxious and depressed and like a kind of like a burn victim, almost like if you touch me, it hurts kind of thing. And trauma is another piece of that puzzle when we talk about what your consciousness is getting filtered through. So healing the trauma, healing the nervous system gave me a good runway, a healthy runway for my consciousness to land. Okay.
I love that. Mm-hmm.
I love that too. I've never said that out loud. So that's just for us and our listeners today. That's a new concept that just got channeled through. So when the consciousness has a clear runway, then we have discernment. We can see what's going on without being compelled to join in to the drama, trauma triangle. And we've got wisdom that kind of exceeds what our normal everyday human consciousness can, fathom in some way. So healing the nervous system, healing the trauma, these are two really big pieces of the spiritual awakening. I'll call it a puzzle path. And also understanding that there's this whole thing on TikTok about like, is your mental health actually a spiritual gift? Like, probably not. Actually, it's probably, if anything, the mental health stuff interferes with our spiritual gifts. The spiritual gifts become distorted because of the mental health issues. Also, things like alcohol, marijuana, like any kind of substances that you put in even sugar can distort how consciousness runs through the body. Now, our consciousness is a precious gift. It's also a commodity in our world. And so where you're allowing your consciousness to go is going to impact how consciousness is expressed as well. So if you're spending time scrolling on social media and looking at all the fear porn or whatever's out there, that's what's going to influence how the consciousness actually expresses itself, is creative, is intuitive.
I know from my experience, I just kind of want to underline this to people, especially if you're coming out of religious experience, it's very fear-based about like the end and like your soul and all of these things. And it can be any shade of that fear. And for me, what I didn't realize until I was on the other side was how activated my nervous system was for so long. And so
Yes.
when you get on that other side and you realize, like in your spiritual awakening and also your healing, which I think they are two sides of the same coin that happen in parallel, your nervous system starts to relax. And sometimes, like you said about having that consciousness come through, it creates this really clear seeing and being with yourself in a way that you wouldn't have experienced while your nervous system was activated. That was definitely true for me in my experience. I don't know if you have anything else to say about that.
Societal, cultural, religious programs also interfere with how consciousness is expressed.
Yeah.
And so I just started reading this book and I was looking to see if I have that reference. There's a woman, she's a podcaster. Her podcast is called Pulling the Thread. And she's actually written a book that I'm going to look up in a second and tell you what the name is. But she basically links women being good girls to the 7 deadly sins.
Yeah.
And how because we think these things are sinful, like the one that pinged for me was we think that pride is sinful. So we reject our talents. We think that lust is sinful, so we reject our pleasure. Do you see what I'm saying? So we spend a lot of time in these religious programs that are telling us how we need to be, that we need a savior, that in Catholicism, you were raised Catholic too, so I'm sure you heard this in the Mass. Every time you go to Mass and it's right before communion, I am not worthy to receive you. So it gets at worthiness, it gets at deservedness, and it also gets at this thing of like, you'll get your reward in heaven, but you can't have it now. You have to wait for it. So there's all of these programs that we have playing out that when you become aware of them, you can actually untangle yourself from those knots and liberate yourself from them. And that's the greatest gift of having this vast consciousness we have access to, is that there's a solution to every problem, but first you have to become aware of what the problem is. And if you've got any of the good girl syndrome, the imposter syndrome, anything like that, good boy syndrome, anything like that, we can trace those back to the root and pull those up by the root and untangle consciousness from those programs. So that then you're making decisions based on the clarity of who you actually are versus what other people, other communities, other entities would have told you that you are.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I think that's a great segue to talk about your book, Smart Girls in the 21st Century, understanding talented girls and women. When we think about that example you just used here about pride, and we could list probably, 30 people in our current life right now who have a talent, who are driven, who are ambitious, who are watering it down wherever they are living in their ecosystem and working. Let's talk about, what is that book about? What was its inception, and what is it here to help people understand about working with women from a talent position instead of sort of having them drown that down?
I love that question. I love that book. Smart Girls in the 21st Century is a co-authored book that I wrote with my mentor from grad school, Barb Kerr. She actually wrote the first edition of Smart Girls way back in the 80s when she studied my generation of talented girls, bright and talented girls. And so this Smart Girls in the 21st Century took that idea of what does it mean to be a smart girl? What does it mean to be a girl who is, or a woman who is gifted and talented, meaning has a very fast brain in their head, have profound abilities, and why aren't they achieving? Why aren't they contributing in the way that we know is possible? Why are they not living up to their potential? And so this book really takes a look at the societal, the cultural, the religious influences that might help us understand what smart girls are up against in the world. And we also, from a spiritual perspective, we also look at one of the gifts being spiritual intelligence. So we know that there's emotional intelligence and there's verbal and linguistic intelligence. There are these multiple intelligences. But the one that we talk about later in the book is spiritual intelligence, the capacity to alter your consciousness in the service of yourself or somebody else. It's one that gets widely overlooked in the larger community because everyone is so focused on, well, just be a high achiever, just be really, if you're really smart, things will work out for you. And it's not the case.
Work really hard.
If you just work really, really hard and keep your head down, someone will eventually notice and the cream will rise to the top. And that's not the case. And the other thing that I love about that book, we were ahead of our time in terms of what we're talking about with diversity, inclusion, and belonging. Mm-hmm. And we come in with this understanding that the closer somebody is to the center of privilege and power, the easier it is for them to achieve, to fulfill their potential. Mm-hmm. The further out somebody gets from the center of privilege and power based on age, religion, ethnicity, race, all of these, disability, both acquired disability and inherit, just disability that you were born with, neurodiversity, all of these layers pull, in this case, women away from the center of privilege and power, right? Mm-hmm. And the more layers we have to move through in order to accomplish our greatest goals and dreams, the more layers we have to move through in order to fill our potential. That's what takes so long. And so part of this, the idea of the book is helping people understand, first of all, who you are. So, Krista, if you choose to read that book, you will read a chapter about talented women and you'll be like, oh my God. Or you might even read the chapter about talented little girls and go, oh my gosh, that's so me. I so relate to that, right? Yeah. So when we look at the whole of the book, what we're really wanting to do is just create an educational perspective on understanding the psychology of gifted and talented girls and women. My favorite pieces are the pieces about eminent women, helping us understand what are the pathways to eminence, meaning the women who have actually changed their fields in some way. So we wrote about, you remember Malala, the little girl from Pakistan who was shot, Mm-hmm. And now right after the book came out, or right around the time the book came out, she actually won the Nobel Peace Prize.
Yes.
So that was pretty special. But we wrote about just some of the women who have made great strides in their fields and what it took for them to do. And here's one thing that we realized is that the women who are eminent first fall in love with an idea. And then, the question always is, who am I supposed to be with? Who's my life partner? That's a question that often arises for people, for women like you and me. And so what we found with these eminent women is that first they fall in love with an idea. They pursue their ideas. And their partner shows up when, kind of in the wake of pursuing their idea. Okay, so we sometimes, I think, in culture and society get it backwards. You're supposed to, you get married, you have the babies,
there's
and
a very specific prescription for that.
Yes, and if you're not doing that, there must be something wrong with you. So, but when we look at the psychology of the eminent women, what we're seeing is a very different pattern emerging in terms of how they're doing life, and it is very different from the status quo. So that's Smart Girls. And things have changed. It's 10 years. I can't believe it'll be 10 years.
Yeah, I definitely want to pick it up. You just said so many good things back there. I kind of don't know which one to pick up. I think the one I want to comment on is about the eminence. And I felt like that in my life as well, because I did follow that prescription and the prescription was not correct. And I specifically spent a lot of alone time after I got subsequently divorced, healing, integrating, liberating, all of these buzzwords we hear now about coming into ourselves. And I can say this with just 100% honesty here, that like having the freedom to just go and pursue like my own understanding of myself in the world really relaxed in me the need to like find a partner. And I've recently, in the last few years, found somebody who I want to spend the rest of my life. And to your point, they just showed up. I wasn't looking for them. I had no understanding that somebody like this could appear in my life who would compliment me in such a way. And that like all that cultivation of myself on the outside could seem selfish, but I was actually becoming the right partner for this person whenever they showed up. And we both have really similar qualities of how we relate and love one another. There's no way I could have been this person, 10 years ago.
Right.
So
Yeah,
I love that you said that.
for sure. And my husband showed up in the same way. I had been divorced for a long, long time at that point, and I remember I was so frustrated because I was doing like the Match.com. I think that Tinder had just come out, like
All the
that
things.
nonsense, like all the things. And I got broken up with at Starbucks, and I got broken up with in a text message, and I'm like, what is even happening here? And finally, I remember I sat down at my altar space, and I went toe to toe with God, and I was like, I don't know where he is, but you do, and you better tell him to get here because I'm ready and I don't want to do this alone anymore. And within about 6 weeks of that, after I prayed that prayer, and I just got back to work, I just dove back into the work I was doing with my international coaching practice and just did all that. And then 6 weeks later, I met my girlfriend at the counter at True Food Kitchen in Scottsdale, and my husband of now 7 years sat down next to me and asked for the baseball game for the TV. And I knew that night we would get married. It just is such an encouragement, I think, because sometimes especially if you've got a smart brain in your head, like we think we can control so many things, and we can really bulldoze our way through a lot, but bulldozing through life can create burnout. And it certainly takes away from the magic that is available to us when we say our prayers and we set our intentions and we live life that's in a way that's in alignment with what the vision is that we've seen in our mind's eye.
Girl, and I love a good bulldozing moment, but you know what I've learned
100%.
about bulldozing? It's also a diversion. So it creates more work on the back end, and I think it's important to say that because there's also this like idea of being in flow and in sort of your self-led energy when you're making decisions that I deeply understand now, but in the past wanting to have that control. And I think as women, we could even unpack this control dynamic for the fact that a lot of our lives are not, we're not given a lot of control and agency early on. So we're constantly fighting for that. A byproduct of that is the bulldozing. And then when you bulldoze, you create diversions and, you're taking 6 steps back instead of 2 steps forward. I don't think it can be really conveyed any differently to just allow and trust as you're navigating your life and your experiences is just it's so important.
I think it's the greatest lesson, and one that many, many, many of us are here to master.
Yeah.
Is that we get into this either my hands are on the steering wheel and I'm white knuckling and nothing's going to stop me, or you take your hands off and you're like, okay, I'm going to sit on the
You're
couch and eat
flying off the
bonbons
road.
and watch, Mrs. Maisel or something. And it's like, and then no, it's like it is a collaboration. It's a
Yes.
collaboration between you and the divine in terms of what you're bringing in, and it's that's the mastery.
Mm-hmm. Knowing the space and the pause is the master's path and when to go forward. It's
That's
incredible.
good. That's really good.
Yeah. Yeah,
That
I
should be
want
a t-shirt.
to yeah. Oh, we'll add that to the list. I want to talk to you. You mentioned back there, so we're kind of weaving multiple thoughts and conversations here, but it's all going to come together in the work that you do. I was really interested in talking to you because I myself have lived in the corporate world for a long time, in healthcare specifically. I've held really high leadership positions. I'm in a high leadership position right now, and have been incredibly ambitious in my life. Having that spiritual experience in tandem of, climbing the corporate ladder is very disconcerting. It's still very hard even now to navigate people who lack self-awareness, even though there's like mentoring programs and there's career development, but there's always this chunk that's missing, which I think is the spiritual intelligence piece that I really want to unpack more with you when you're working with leaders. So when you're working with leaders, I'm really curious for myself and for the listening audience, what are you telling people about how to juggle all those things in a environment that is not always conducive to openness, communication, emotional intelligence, and spirituality?
Well, first of all, Krista, you should know that I am the best kept secret among women leaders in tech and healthcare.
Okay, perfect.
Okay. Especially those of you who are emotionally intelligent. It's like you all have an underground network, and eventually someone will say, you need to work with Robyn, you need to talk to Robyn. And that's how you all land in my world. It's almost like you're teleported here. And so whether it's the engineers or the physicians, the human factors experts, you all have, and I'm speaking collectively to the high EQ, the emotionally intelligent women who are natural leaders. So it's a very niched area that I'm speaking to. And they often will come to me when they're burned out, because all the hard work, the grit, the tenacity, the keep your head down and don't promote yourself because someone will notice you and elevate you. Of those circumstances are what bring women like you into my world. So the first thing I always do with emotionally intelligent female leaders who come into my world is I give them the personality assessment and I teach them who they are. Because oftentimes in all of the work that we've done and all the leadership work that we've done, and listen, I've been there, done that, got the t-shirt, wrote the book on being an emotionally intelligent human in the tech space or in the corporate space. What we don't always understand is why we feel so different from everybody else. And yes, emotional intelligence can be taught. To a pretty good proportion of the population can kind of get like, I can kind of imagine what it's like to walk around in somebody else's shoes. But there's a subset of the population, and I suspect that you're one of them, that I call hyper empathic. Mm-hmm. Not just to be able to be aware of somebody else's experience, but to literally feel it in your body. Mm-hmm. To be able to have a very clear sense of sitting at a conference table and being able to tune into what everybody at the conference table is feeling, who's checked in, who's checked out, who's got a bee in their bonnet, who's got a snarky comment that's waiting for the right point to cut somebody down, who's going to copy your idea. You can probably see all of those things, right? Mm-hmm. So that is an unusual gift that gets downplayed, ignored, criticized, and ultimately disempowered. Mm-hmm. So I want to stop there for a second and see what comes up for you as I share that piece.
Yeah. Well, and thank you for reflecting that back and being able to see that in me. I think one of the things that was challenging for me in my life was having having that perceptibility, excuse me. I think we would probably call it now more empathy, emotional intelligence. We could loop it into a lot of things. It was hard because you can see things as they are, yes. And you can see them as they are in work situations, and you're observing everyone all the time, and for some reason making very quick distinctions about the environment, the atmosphere. And to your point, if you're somebody that's doing this, sometimes it was conveyed to me as a direct, like the communication's too direct because I'm perceiving things as they are, and people are not always ready to perceive things as they are. So I think for me, I don't know what you have to say about that. It's been a very big and bumpy curve, a learning curve to manage that talent. And to navigate the sensitivity of everyone as well, and do it in a really diplomatic and peaceful way.
Your ability to say what you think is your greatest gift. And when you say what you think, people don't like it. So you learn how to couch your words, frame them so that it's more palatable for other people. Now, here's the thing. This was a big game changer for me because I am one of the hyper empaths, and I'm guessing that you are as well. Just being able to read the room, go into any space and just kind of figure out like what the dynamics are.
Yeah.
And I'm guessing that you can probably also see, like if you're looking at a project timeline, you can see where the disruptions are going to be. You can see where the slowdowns are, and you probably even know who are going to be the culprits who are slowing things down, either intentionally or unintentionally. So
I
is
feel
this
so seen and heard right now. I cannot tell you. Not to make this podcast interview about me, but wow, I do. Yeah.
so because of that, you know, there can come with that a responsibility that I have to fix everything because I can see it. And so one of the things, by the way, you're not alone, even though it can feel very lonely. When you show up in my world, you meet other women and you're like, oh my God, you exist? I thought I was the only one. And getting you all in a room together, you just stare at each other for a little while. In disbelief that there are other people who are actually like you, who have the same abilities that you do. But because nobody talks about this and nobody teaches this, we just think we're weirdos that and nobody knows what to do with us. So a lot of the early work that I do is just teaching you who you are and healing these ideas that you have about yourself that you're somehow wrong for just being you. And here's what I believe in corporate. What I know to be true in corporate is up until this point, people have been promoted into leadership because of something that they have done as an individual contributor, which probably has something to do with grit, hard work, tenacity. They're really good technically, but they get promoted into these positions of leadership where they're not great interpersonally. And unless and until we start hiring for interpersonal ability and looking at it as a true ability rather than, oh, if I could get rid of the term soft skills, I would burn that to the ground. Don't insult me by calling the gift that I came into this world with a soft skill. This is surgical. And I'm
And
wanting
knowing how
to,
to have that neutrality, like you said, the
yes,
precision of that neutrality to let that information land on somebody where they don't feel agitated or activated, and they can pick up that information and ingest it or reject it. That is really precise. That is really difficult to do. It is a hard skill. It is not a soft skill.
it's surgical. And so when you understand that you're actually a surgeon going into the space with this array of awareness of maybe you see colors, maybe you see their bioenergy field, so you can see like who's like really agitated right now or whatever, and being able to navigate the energetics of any kind of dynamic that requires diplomacy, that requires, sometimes it does require kind of a scorpion sting to move people as well. And hopefully, in the discernment pieces, you do that in private, not in public. That's the big thing. So the other thing that I will say about the hyper empaths who are in the tech, biotech, healthcare space is that I really do believe that the future is we are being hired for those exact abilities rather than, oh, she's really good technically. Oh, and by the way, she's a people person too. Well, and here's the thing is I had an opportunity. I was meeting with an SVP at a major tech company about the women wanted to bring me in to have these conversations with his group. And he was majority culture. He got there through his, I'm using merit here, but through the pathway that a majority culture man would get through up into this place. And so we're having this conversation and he leans back in his chair and about me coming in, he leans back in his chair and says, well, you're a little bit too touchy-feely for me. You're a little bit too woo for me. And I'm like, okay. So that tells me much more about where he is with his own emotional intelligence than where I am with mine. But it also really put a fire under me to bring to light how important it is for us to get really comfortable with saying, I am emotionally intelligent. This is one of my talents. It's one of my gifts. And this is what I bring to the table. Rather than what I found myself doing, even with that guy, was kind of like softening and acquiescing and just, I understand and I'm very good at that. But also, he just insulted me, like knowingly or unknowingly. And I wasn't necessarily insulted, but you get the point. Like,
Yeah.
would you tell like somebody who's technically expert that you're just a little bit too whatever? No.
Yeah.
So we have a lot of work to do in this area. The work that I do with women like you is very much grassroots. It's one-on-one, and it's really teaching more the energetics of leadership than anything else. Because what I know to be true, and this happens with the women who I work with in healthcare and in tech, is that when you sit at the table and you can actually understand the energetics of what's going on in the room, you can start to shift things energetically just by who you are being, without having to do the army crawl slog into the duty, responsibility, hard work kind of paradigm. So we get much more into flow. We get much more into creativity. We get much more into intuition and honoring intuition, so that you become the go-to person for what's coming up. I've got a client whose colleagues now, she's high EQ. Her colleagues call her 100%. Because they'll go to her with a project and they'll say, okay, pinpoint where the problems are. And she has a history of being able to pinpoint exactly where the holdups are going to be. And now they move around it because they know that she's so accurate at being able to find them.
I'll just say this one last thing because we're getting towards the end here and I want to get in just one more question. But I think number one, anyone that's listening, it's good just to hear this information and to relax into the idea that there might be underdeveloped skills that live within you that you have been diminishing in your life, not just in work, but I think for me, I've always been incredibly ambitious. And in the box of Catholicism, the patriarchy and masculinity, that's not something that is very often heralded in a woman.
It's not very feminine, Krista.
It's not very feminine, no. It's not. And so one thing is to also, I think for the women that are listening to this and even the men who have had to sort of dim that part of themselves is find a lot of solitude in this conversation about, there is a place for you to amplify those things in yourself that also works in a corporate environment or in a workplace or in your family systems. I think that's what we're trying to say here, and I just wanted to underline that as an added bonus. You have a couple things going on that I wanted to touch base on, so we're going to take a hard right turn here. You've just started your own podcast as well, so I wanted to talk to you about what is this podcast called, what is it about, what are you hoping to accomplish over there, and what do you want people to know when they tune into it?
So I've been podcasting for a while. I actually have an older podcast called Mindset RX that was really based for corporate. And we have a lot of good information over there that's still available. And my new podcast is called Becoming the Channel. And that podcast is all about channeling wealth consciousness. It's all about spiritual psychology. And I'm talking to very, very successful, spiritually intelligent leaders on what it actually means to channel wealth consciousness for prosperity on all levels of your life. So not just, it is about money, but it's also about, just creating a new understanding and relationship with money, with wealth, with yourself, and with your consciousness. And so I've had so many great guests on the podcast already, and it's just one of my favorite things. We just released a solo episode today where I talk about this vision quest that I had and the horses that came in. I called in a herd of wild horses, and they helped me reconnect with the vision that I've had for a long, long time. So that's just so special. So that's the podcast, and it just is a contribution to the conversation around waking up, fully expressing your spiritual gifts, and doing so in a way that's in most alignment with who you are meant to be and the work, the contributions that you're meant to make on this earth.
I love that. Well, we'll link it in the show notes for sure.
Thank you.
And then what is it that you do in terms of people working for you, working with you, excuse me. We've talked about it a little here and there, but like if somebody was wanting to work with you, what could they do with you? So we'll highlight that and then we'll sort of wrap it up here.
So there are going to be some of your listeners who are going to be like, how do I work with you? The way that I always start, and I referenced this a little bit earlier, is I always start with the personality assessment. It's called the NEO. It's the gold standard of personality assessments. Psychologists have used it for generations at this point, actually, to understand personality. The thing that I love about it is that it's norm-based and standardized. So just like remember taking the ACT or the SAT where you got a percentile score on how you compared to your peers. This is the only time I agree with comparison is with this NEO because the people who find their way into my world have very unique profiles that are outside of average. They are all outliers. The problem with most of you is, and for me too, and research is me search, right? So I learned this about myself. The problem is that we're so far outside of average that we think that there's something wrong with us. And so the early work that somebody does with me, regardless of what we do next, I have private mentoring that I do with, especially for women in tech and healthcare around leadership, but we always start with the NEO. So the way that you get started with the NEO is that you can just actually book a call with me, drrobynmckay.com/call. And in that time, we'll talk about what the next best step for you is. Is it just to do the NEO, learn about yourself, and then go off and do your own thing? Or is there something bigger for you? But that's a really great point of entry for anybody who's curious about hyper empathy, understanding your nervous system, understanding your spiritual intelligence, your intuition, understanding why you are the way you are is one of the greatest gifts that I can give to anybody who comes in to work with me.
Yeah, beautiful.
I'm a little bit, do you know X-Men? The X-Men?
Yes.
Okay. So you know Professor Xavier, how he goes into Cerebro and like finds all the mutants or the outliers.
I have likened it to Divergence, the movie, because
Yes.
to me that's what it does feel like. It's the same idea that there's all these cookie cutter personality styles, whatever, and then there's this divergent group of people,
Yes.
which a lot of us find ourselves as divergents. That's how I understand it for myself. Like
I love that. And I love that book series.
Yeah.
You're divergent and so am I. And so we really want to call us together because we all have a unique piece of the puzzle or a unique thread in the tapestry that we're meant to contribute that only you can and that only I can. And unless and until we all gather in this big loom that we're creating for our future, we're just standing with a thread going, what do I even do with this thread?
Am I going to do with this thread?
What is this gold thread?
I can't make a scarf.
I don't know. But when you come in and you're with the community of others who are hyper empaths, who are visionaries, who are way showers, who are natural born leaders, and also highly intuitive, we have work to do. And there is a big mission. And it is not something that you got taught in school.
No. And it's interesting to think about as well. Sometimes I think there can be a lot of fear as you're having your spiritual awakening and you're understanding non-physical abilities, gifts, and relationship to this three-dimensional world. It can seem a little scary, but also too, you feel I'll just speak for myself here in my own thing, in my own experiences. You can start to feel powerful, like that you can change things, but you're one person, and that can also feel very disconcerting. And you think about what you just said right now about like all of us collectively getting together. I can maybe turn the dial a little bit just working by myself and just a little bit. But it's not enough to make the grander shift that we need to do as the world and the collective is creating its own evolution and its own awakening. We all have to sort of hold on to the thing and go and like shift it over, with all of our might and our power in our hands. So it's important for us to be in community with each other.
Yeah, it's the time for siloing yourself has passed. And here's the thing that I know
And it's
about
masculine.
it is. And here's the thing that I know about women leaders in particular. The last thing that we want to do is hang out with other girls.
It's very
Like
hard.
nobody in my world raises their hand and comes to me and says, "Hey, Doc Robyn, do you have like a group of like women who I can like hang out with?" Like that's the last thing, because we have so many sister wounds and mother wounds and all the things. And yet when we get past this initial just understanding who you are and you start meeting people who are actually like you, and you're in a community of your creative and intellectual peers, that's where the transformation happens. So it's something that we don't really recognize that we need or definitely don't want, but it is as a part of this, I'm going to call it an army that is gathering to create this next chapter in what's happening in our world. It's really a lot of fun, actually, to find your people, to find your herd for the wild horses, and to be a herd of wild horses. Oof, there's nothing more powerful than a herd of wild horses. So you come and join the herd, and we will run together in the open prairie and have a big time.
Okay, so we'll leave it there. I always end in gratitude as well. Not that we've ever been on a low note during this conversation, but I always just want to like center in with you. Check what's happening in your world as far as like what you're grateful for. 3 things this week, this month, this year, anything that you're sort of centering yourself in terms of gratitude with.
You know, gratitude is the first cause of all good things. And so whether they're big or small, and I think it's so important to, that's a thread that we can weave together into the tapestry. So the first being that came to mind was Cooper. You may have heard him. I'm hoping that he was muted, but Cooper is my golden doodle. He's 2.5, and he hunts lizards. And so when there are lizards in the courtyard, he announces it. So I'm so grateful for him because he's been such a heart opener in our family. I love to see my husband's eyes light up when Cooper comes into the room. It's just such a wonderful, heartwarming and connected experience. I'm grateful for that. I'm grateful for this conversation with you, Krista. Grateful to know you. And I think that the work that you're doing is so important to make waves in this world that needs more light, and you're creating that. You're weaving more light into this world. And I'm grateful. I'm really grateful for my own heart, for my willingness to share so transparently my experiences. There was a time earlier in my life where I would have been trembling and worried about what people think about me, and is she crazy, and what is she even talking about? And now I feel like I've come to a point in my life where you can take it or leave it. And I know who I am, and I am grateful, beyond grateful, that I know who I am, and I know what my vision is, and I know who I'm here for.
Yeah, I love that too. That is the greatest gift this experience can give anybody. So I love that you ended with that. Well, I had a wonderful time with you. I love what you're doing. I want to know everything. I'm going to ingest all things Dr. Robyn McKay after this, because you are definitely a mirror to all the things that interest me and make me want to continue on this life path that has chosen me. So I really appreciate you coming on here and taking time with me, and I had a wonderful time with you.
Thanks for having me.
This podcast was written, directed, and produced by me, your host, Krista Xiomara, in alignment with LightCasting. Music curated and created by Mr. Pixie. You can find I'm Awake Now What on all social media channels by searching IANW Podcast. Head over to your favorite podcast app and subscribe, download, rate, and review. Come back every Sunday to partake in a new and enlightening conversation. May you be filled with love and light until we meet again.